Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Before we dive into today's podcast episode, I just want to take a minute to remind you to like and subscribe and share the podcast if you have not already on whatever podcast platform you're listening on right now. Go give it a 5-star rating. Even better if you want to leave a review. It really helps other people to find the podcast. So I appreciate it if you take 2 seconds to go do that. And now we will dive into today's podcast episode. So today we are going to be talking about mental rehearsal, or sometimes this is called motor imagery, or sometimes we just refer to this as visualization. And specifically today, I want to talk about mental rehearsal in the context of dancers who may be able to not fully participate physically in dance. This has been coming up a lot right now in the clinic with dancers who are injured, and especially with dancers who have important things coming up, hint nutcracker season. And so a lot of dancers understandably start to feel a little bit kind of panicked in terms of like, what can I do? Am I going to be ready? Can I come back in time to perform? And especially if we're working with tight timelines. And I've had a few dancers recently where there's like some, fairly tight timelines where it's like, yes, we can probably make this happen to be back in time for said performance, or it could be a competition, an exam, whatever it is. In this case, it happens to be performances. But we need to do sort of everything possible to make sure that that dancer is going to get there in time. And dancers often have this fear of being like, will I fall behind? Will I be ready? I'm going to be out of shape. I'm going to not be able to perform to my highest potential with having a time, like a break or time off from dance. And so we've been talking a lot, or I have been talking with individual dancers in the clinic a lot about the use of mental rehearsal or motor imagery or mental imagery as a way of making sure that we can stay prepared to perform when we maybe cannot be doing everything physically at 100%. So there are lots of other contexts, and there's actually like really fascinating research in terms of visualization and this mental imagery and all of that. So I may do another episode in the future about some of the other uses of it, but specifically today, I want to talk about it from the perspective of kind of maintaining preparation for performance, or how we can utilize it in that respect if we have a dancer who is potentially not participating physically 100%. So just a little caveat to say, I know that this is a much bigger area of kind of research and there is more information out there, but I'm going to focus on like the physical attributes of it for the purposes of this week's podcast episode. So basically, what is mental rehearsal or motor imagery, or whatever we want to call it? I will probably just use both terms interchangeably today. Essentially, it is mentally simulating a movement, so either visually and or kinesthetically, and I'll talk a little bit more about the difference between those later on in the episode. But it is mentally simulating a movement without physical exertion. So again, most commonly, people might think about this or talk about this as visualization. But there are physical benefits to this. So obviously, we know from a performance anxiety standpoint or other kind of cognitive standpoints, there are benefits, but there are physical benefits as well. So the physical benefits in terms of like, how does that work? Because we think like, okay, wait a second, we're just like imagining or visualizing us performing. How does that have a physical carryover into the body? Well, one school of thought is that it activates the same motor networks that would be activated with actual physical movement. So we have the same motor cortical and subcortical areas of the brain that actually are activated when we are doing actual movements. And so that just maintains those motor pathways. So the messages and signals that are going from the brain into the periphery to like our muscles or things like that. And then vice versa, the sensory messages that are getting sent from the periphery, from our limbs and our muscles back into the central nervous system. We are maintaining and activating those same neural pathways with imagery or visualization as we are with actual physical movement. So that is one way that we likely see these benefits of mental rehearsal or motor imagery. And then also it is thought to sort of preserve the neuromusculoskeletal drive and motor representation. So again, this has to do with the nervous system, but when we have movements and especially skilled movement patterns, they sort of are almost like mapped in our brain is maybe the easiest way to kind of explain it or to visualize it. But if we stop using those motor programs or those like motor patterns, we will actually start to get less representation of those. And so again, with this mental imagery, it's just thought to preserve those networks and that motor representation so that we maintain those connections or that messaging within the nervous system. So that's kind of just in terms of if you're wondering like, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. How does this work? Like how can visually, imagining something actually have physical outputs? That is how it's working. And we've talked on this podcast before lots about the nervous system. And so we have, an appreciation for how the nervous system is governing basically all functions within our body. So this is just another example of how that happens. But in terms of those physical benefits or physical outcomes, what is actually happening or what are they? If we dive into the research, as I like to do, there is a little bit of research specifically within dance populations, and I'll come to that in a minute, but most of the research that we are looking at is in athletic populations. Some of it's in general population. There's actually lots of research that's done just in rehab settings. And so this could be with people with all sorts of varied injuries, just in rehabilitation settings. And then some of it is done in athletic populations. And then, like I said, there's a little bit of research in dance populations as well. So one of the benefits that we see is we see attenuation of strength loss. And so basically what that means is generally if we are immobilized, and these studies in particular actually were looking at kind of immobilization. So say we broke something and we're in a boot or we're in a cast or we're unable to move that body part, so it's immobilized, we would expect a loss of strength. We know that that happens with immobilization, and it actually happens fairly quickly, like that loss of strength. But if we can utilize mental rehearsal or motor imagery, we can slow down or attenuate that loss of strength. So in terms of numbers, like what are we looking at? What does the research say? In a general, like immobilized population, and again, this was not an athletic population. This is more of a just like a rehabilitation population. But there was on average a 45% strength loss of the immobilized limb. But in the group that used mental imagery and mental rehearsal, there was a 20 to 25% strength loss. So that's a difference of, like 20 to maybe 25% there if we are utilizing this tool of motor imagery so we can kind of decrease how much strength we are losing. Again, we know that we are going to lose strength with immobilization, and that's why we try and immobilize for like the shortest period of time necessary. So, if we have a dancer who, say, has I don't know what's an easy example, a metatarsal fracture, they may be immobilized in a boot. We want to try and minimize the amount of time that is happening because we know there's going to be strength loss. But even if they are immobilized, we can decrease that strength loss by using some of these outcomes. Another effect that we see in terms of the physical effects is we can maintain range of motion and movement quality. So really they were looking a lot at like stiffness in joints or stiffness of movement patterns compared with the groups that are not using motor imagery as part of their rehabilitation. So for dancers especially, that is one of the things that dancers are often most concerned about it's probably not the thing I, as a clinician, am most concerned about. I am much more concerned about loss of strength and things like that. But dancers are definitely very concerned about losing mobility, losing range of motion, being stiff, their movements looking stiff. And so we can use motor imagery to actually decrease those effects. We know that the use of motor imagery can actually help to preserve aspects of motor planning, and especially for skilled movements. So motor planning is essentially how well our nervous system and our brain can plan out and then send the appropriate signals to execute movements. And the obviously harder the movement or more skilled the movement is, the more motor planning is required for that. And as dancers, that is really often what we are doing in rehearsal. When we rehearse something over and over and over again, is we're refining those motor planning pathways, those neural networks, and we're like fine-tuning those. And we can lose some of those if we are not actively participating in something. But again, the use of motor imagery or mental rehearsal can actually help us to preserve those aspects of motor planning. And the cool thing with this research is that the effect seems to be greater the more skilled the movement is. So the harder the movement is, the more we can kind of preserve those aspects. And it's probably because less skilled movement patterns. So say we think about something like walking or a squat or something like that. We've likely been doing that for a really, really long time. And so it's probably a bit more ingrained in our motor planning, and therefore it requires a little bit less fine-tuning, whereas these skilled movement patterns are more complex. They require more fine-tuning, and so we're more likely to lose them quickly if we're not practicing them. And so again, if we can't physically practice them, if we can mentally practice them or mentally rehearse them, we can actually maintain some of those aspects. There are some studies, so I'm moving down the list here, there are some studies that suggest that we can actually gain strength through the use of motor imagery. This, I will say, with like a little bit of a caveat in that in the studies that show this, it is very, very, very small effects. And the research on this is much less conclusive. There are some studies that show this, but equally there are studies that have not been able to replicate that. So again, I think the slowing down of the loss of strength is a really, really important factor for us to consider. I don't know that we are always going to see increases in strength, but some of the research does show that we may see very small strength gains. The research for this is much, much stronger when mental rehearsal or motor imagery is combined with physical practice as well. And so this becomes really interesting and kind of an exciting area of like, when we think about performance enhancement in dancers, not necessarily our injured dancers, this could be our healthy dance population. We know we're doing a lot of physical practice, but if we start to combine that with more intentional uses of motor imagery, could we be getting even better outputs or even better performance? So that's something, just to plant that kind of seed of thought in through there. But from a rehabilitation standpoint, I mean, again, the evidence is like a little bit inconclusive, but there is some research that shows that there potentially could be very small effects compared to not using this. So in dancers specifically, they've actually looked mostly at like task-specific skills. So looking at a specific dance move and then having like groups where one group only like rehearses that dance move and another group uses motor imagery to rehearse the dance move as well. And they have had improvements in task-specific task-specific improvements. And then there's also some research and some evidence to show that it can help. So imagery can help with skill retention, and especially when our movements are limited. So again, this would be a dancer who can't physically participate 100%. If we want to think about skill retention, in terms of probably learning and picking up choreography, really purposefully using motor imagery can be really helpful. And so this is something that I think for some people comes really naturally, and for other people, they have to be taught how to do this, or they have to be taught that this is something that they can be utilizing and can be doing. And so this is probably the difference between, I'm sure everybody out there has experienced a dancer who is injured, or maybe they're just sick or something like that. So they're sitting out and they're watching a class, and some dancers can pick up the choreography, whether it's a combo or whether it is, like choreography for a dance or whatever. Some dancers can pick it up really easily by watching it, and other dancers not so much. They actually have to be like physically participating. This is obviously much more complex because we have different types of learners, like visual learners versus kinesthetic learners and things like that. But the research does show that the dancers who have the ability to then use motor imagery to rehearse will retain that more. And I think our dancers who seem to kind of just quote unquote naturally pick things up easier from the sidelines are likely using that skill, whether it is conscious or unconsciously. Like, I think there are people who just really vividly imagine things within their mind naturally, and other dancers who you would actually have to like teach them or train them to use this as a skill within their toolbox. So that's kind of like a little bit of an aside, but just this is something, I think it's worth mentioning that it is something that will come naturally to some people, but will probably not come as naturally to other people. So in terms of like protocols, or like how do we implement this? How should we be doing this? What is best practice? In the research, protocols that specify really what they call vivid kinesthetic imagery or action-focused scripts or imagery tend to have better results than people where it is more of a visual practice. And I'm going to break this down and explain what that is. So we can have visualization or mental rehearsal, or whatever we want to call it, that is more based on visual images. So this would be like the equivalent of imagining that you're watching the dance happening on stage, if that makes sense. And so this might be a dancer imagining they're in the audience and seeing themselves up on the stage. So it's really visual. They're like seeing themselves perform the dance. More commonly, and because of like right-left switching, dancers, I think instinctively will imagine they are on the stage, but they're seeing themselves visually performing what is happening. And there are benefits to that for sure. But when we are looking again at these physical benefits that we want to maintain, whether that is, strength or range of motion and all of those things we just talked about, the research shows that if we can use more kinesthetic imagery, so more movement-based imagery, that actually has a sort of bigger success rate or more carryover into performance outcomes and performance goals. So what we mean by kinesthetic imagery is actually imagining the movements themselves and how they feel in your body. So not just imagining what it would look like if you were doing them, but how it would feel. So if we are, doing a plie, what muscles are activating? Where do you feel the work coming from? If you're lifting your leg or kicking your leg, where do you feel that work? Where do you feel the lift coming from? Like all of those types of things. It's much more like, they use the word in the research a lot, like vivid imagery, in the sense that it's a little bit more complex and in depth from a kinesthetic perspective of how does that feel in your body. This, especially for dancers, I think is powerful because dancers tend to be very good at feeling things in their body. Like dancers have higher kinesthetic awareness than a lot of other populations, even other sporting or athletic populations. Dancers are very body aware. They can tell you like the most minute thing about what feels or does not feel right within their body. And so we can use this to our advantage. So if you want to start to use motor imagery rather than just using the visualization of visually what does it feel like, and that's not to say the visualization or visual imagery is not also effective, because it is, but it is probably more beneficial or worthwhile when we're thinking about maybe more artistic outcomes or musicality outcomes or working on performance anxiety or things like that. When we are looking at these physical outcomes, so again, mostly in populations where dancers are not physically able to dance, and we're looking at, okay, how can we preserve as much of your physicality while you cannot physically dance, we want to try and utilize this more kinesthetic type of motor imagery. And then, like I said, the research really shows that combining motor imagery with physical practice is superior to doing just one or even the other alone. So combining the two of them is actually superior than just doing the movement or just doing the physical practice. We want to have that physical practice with the motor imagery. And this, again, I think really, really applies to dancers because more often than not, when a dancer has an injury, it does not mean that they can't do anything. It's very rare that a dancer is doing 0% physically. So they may be doing, 50% of stuff that they would normally be doing kind of from a physical perspective, or maybe even 75%, or as they're rehabbing and gradually returning, they may be doing some things actually like doing the physical activity. And if we can combine that with the motor imagery, we're going to get superior results. And so again, I think it's just a really great population to be able to apply this with, because oftentimes dancers are able to do some amount physically. But even if you cannot do anything, you're doing 0% physical activity, like at any given moment, there is still benefit to doing the motor imagery. And then in terms of like actual protocol, like, how often and how and where and all of that type of stuff, ideally, you want to be doing this daily, and the research kind of suggests 10 to 20 minutes per day. Again, this is going to probably be dancer specific. It might depend a little bit on how much you are doing in class or rehearsals versus, how often you're having to sit out versus are you sitting out completely? Do you have more time in your day to spend longer on this? One of the things that's really great about dance is also that because it's choreographed to music, we can actually use that to our advantage as well. And so if it is certain dances that you're going to be performing in, i.e. the Nutcracker coming up soon, you can actually play that music and use this motor imagery as you are running through the music. And so it kind of keeps dancers on track, because 20 minutes is a really long time to try and do motor imagery if you're just trying to think about it, because our minds will tend to wander. It's almost like a skill similar to like meditation or things like that, that when dancers are first starting it, they may struggle to be able to maintain it for long periods of time. However, we can use music to sort of keep dancers on track, which can be very, very, very helpful. And I actually don't know if there's been any research that's looked at like using music combined with motor imagery. I'll have to look into that. I didn't come across anything that was specifically talked about like the element of music, but we know that music is really powerful and stimulates the brain in lots of different ways. So that actually would be something interesting to look into. Anyway, so daily 10 to 20 minutes is sort of what the research suggests in terms of frequency. And then like we talked about, we want to focus on those vivid kinesthetic movements. So what the movement feels like, the exact technique that should be utilized with that movement. This is also a way of dancers actually just practicing their technique without, physically doing repetitions hundreds or thousands of times in a row, so we're not overloading their bodies. We can actually really work on technique through motor imagery. And then you want to think about things, and again, this comes down to that sort of vivid kinesthetic imagery where we're thinking about timing and balance and like push off and weight placement, so you can get really nuanced with it. So again, rather than just like visualizing what it would look like, really thinking, okay, then I push off with that foot and then I land with my weight on the other foot and then I have to transfer my weight back and whatever it is. So timing, balance, placement, all of those things we want to incorporate into our motor imagery. And then I've already talked about this, but the last thing on the list in terms of the protocols was that combining it with physical activity where possible does tend to have those superior outcomes. So maybe if we have a dancer who is dancing some, but not at 100% capacity, they might be able to run through a rehearsal dance, say like one time full out, but we don't want to overload them because they're still recovering. And so we're managing tissue loading through an injury or something. So maybe they mentally rehearse it. They do motor imagery of that dance. Then maybe they run it like dancing it, actually physically doing it, and then go back and think about kind of like corrections or what they could have improved on or things like that with motor imagery again. So we can combine these together to get sort of superior results. So I'm going to wrap things up there. I hope that was helpful and gives you an idea of something, even just one little thing, because I think when dancers are injured, we often think a lot about what else they can be doing physically. So it's like, okay, if a dancer's injured and they're not dancing, can they be going to the pool swimming? Can they be riding a bike? Can they be doing rehab exercises? Are they doing strength training? We think about all of those things, and we should be thinking about all of those things, but we don't as often think about this component of how can we use motor imagery to also contribute to their healing and their rehab and getting them back into class and on stage. And it is a piece that I think is very, very accessible to a lot of dancers. And like I said, it's not going to come naturally to every single dancer, but it does tend to come somewhat naturally to a lot of dancers. And again, especially if we combine it with the music and because dancers have so much body awareness. So I think it is a tool or a skill that is maybe underutilized within the dance population right now, and something that we could be using a little bit more often, and just kind of like then, decreasing a bit of anxiety that dancers have with regards to them being out. Because a lot of dancers, if they are sidelined for any length of time, there is a lot of stress and anxiety that surrounds that, and especially if it is leading into like a performance or a show season. And so being able to really have a tool that they feel like they can use successfully and that we know is proven to have really great benefits can be really helpful for them. So hopefully that was helpful. If you are a dancer who's currently sidelined, give it a try. Let me know how it goes. If you have any questions about anything we chatted about on today's podcast, send me a message, send me an email. I always love to hear from all of you. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.